Lecture 53, Alexander Pope.
We turn from Daniel Defoe, journalist, pamphleteer, essayist and novelist, the voice of what we would now call popular culture, to one whose work frequently attacked that popular culture as debased and profit-driven, Alexander Pope. In Orlando, published in 1928 by Virginia Woolf, the ambiguously gendered Orlando takes tea with the poet Mr. Pope and enjoys an hour or two of conversation, but concludes that only reading his poetry can explain why he both amused and frightened his audience. Orlando's response reflects that of many of Pope's contemporary readers to his razor-sharp wit and his sometimes vitriolic attacks on the dunces and pretensions of his contemporary society. Pope's work is not, however, merely witty and satirical, but also deeply moral and thoughtful. In poetry that spanned the genres from pastoral verse to translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad, Pope defended the central concepts of neoclassicism, a belief in the universal values of rational and moderate thought and action, values that would produce an orderly and harmonious human society modeled on the harmony of the natural world. Classical literature most readily embodied these concepts and provided the contemporary writer with aesthetic guidelines for his own works. Pope's first collection of poems, the Pastorals, was published in 1709 when Pope was only 21, and 8 years later he published his collected works, a gesture usually reserved for one's mature years as a poet. But despite his youth, Pope could already claim to have produced a body of poetic material in a variety of forms that are usually the result of a lifetime's labor: pastoral, Georgic, mock epic, heroic, elegiac, didactic verse. Pope articulated the voice of the elite. He saw himself as the preserver of classical values and bitterly satirized hack writers like Defoe, who catered to popular taste and whose writing was commercially driven. Moreover, Pope resented the claim that the values of the middling classes, which is what Defoe represented, were central to what it meant to be English and to practice literature. But Pope was not merely oppositional. He not only defined the aesthetic tastes of his upper-class society, one that seemed to him to be the equivalent of civilization itself, but also satirized the sometimes trivial values of that same society, values which undermined its claim to intellectual and moral superiority. I will discuss two poems central to Pope's moral as well as his aesthetic development. The first, an essay on criticism, published in 1711, demonstrates Pope's skill at philosophical poetry. And the second, the mock epic The Rape of the Lock, which brilliantly satirizes the follies of his own society at the same time as it promotes the values and importance of classical models of behavior, has become one of the most celebrated satiric poems in literature. I will begin by briefly sketching Pope's biography before I turn to the two poems. Alexander Pope was born into a Roman Catholic family in 1688, the year when James II was deposed and replaced by the Protestant William, Duke of Orange, son-in-law to James II. James was deposed because of a long-standing suspicion of Catholics as seditious and more loyal to the Pope than their own country. When James appointed Catholics to high government office and extended freedom of religion beyond dissenting Protestants to include Roman Catholics, he confirmed the English fear of papal control. After James' deposition, Catholics would be disenfranchised until the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. But the penalties of being a Catholic extended far beyond merely voting rights. Alexander Pope could not inherit or purchase land. He could not hold public office, publicly practice his religion, attend university, or live within 10 miles of London. Pope also suffered crippling personal restrictions. Tuberculosis of the spine, which he contracted when he was 12, had left him deformed and stunted in growth. He was only 4 feet 6 inches tall, humpbacked, and spent his life in pain, unable to bathe or dress without help, or hold his body upright without corsets. He spoke about this long disease, my life. His critics called him a humpbacked toad, a virulent and obscene papist. Pope was supported, however, both morally and in his early years financially by other writers, by the publisher of much of his work, John Carroll, and by members of the Catholic aristocracy. He found his companions in those whose politics were essentially conservative and whose artistic taste ran towards social satire. Pope belonged to one of the most famous of all the clubs in this clubbable age, the Scriblerus Club. Writers like John Gay, who wrote The Beggar's Opera, and Jonathan Swift of Gulliver's Travels were also members. Their contempt for popular writing is articulated in their satirical description of the birth of Martin Scriblerus in the Memoirs of Martin Scriblerus, where Martin's mother dreams that the night before his birth she was delivered of a large inkhorn out of which rush streams of ink. In the Dunciad, published in 1728, Pope rages against Eliza Haywood, whose novel Love in Excess rivaled Defoe's Robinson Crusoe as the bestseller in 1719, and popular women writers were parodied and caricatured as hags, whores, and consorts of the devil. The existence of the all-male Scriblerus Club points to the importance in 18th century life of 2 public values, sociability and conversation. Pope argues for the central role that proper behavior and the proper respect for others plays in constructing and advancing a culturally sophisticated and rationally grounded civil society. Let me now turn to the second part of this lecture and examine first Pope's An Essay on Criticism and then Rape of the Lock. As I said, An Essay on Criticism was written by Pope when he was only 21 years old and published anonymously in 1711. The poem belongs to the tradition of Horace's Ars Poetica, a verse essay defining contemporary poetic and critical practice and articulating the poet's own poetic theories. Pope essentially engages in a conversation with the reader, and by so doing he trains the reader how to recognize good poetry from bad. The poem both satirizes contemporary critics for their poor taste and suggests that the reader of the poem must be capable of more discerning taste precisely because she is reading Pope's poem. Thus, Pope creates a community of like-minded readers and critics who will endorse his aesthetic principles. An Essay on Criticism satirizes the poets and critics who lack poetic understanding and articulates the standard by which poets and critics should be guided. Pope employs several key words that he reiterates and redefines as he moves through the poem. Those key words, central to understanding Pope's neoclassical aesthetics, are nature, wit, and judgment. There is no single definition of these terms that could accommodate the varied and subtle ways in which Pope and his audience would understand these concepts, but let me attempt a brief definition. Nature means God's created world manifest in the divine order, the great chain of being, through which the natural world functions. Individual human beings thus should strive to emulate this universal, ordered and rational plan through moral and ethical laws. And society is subject through political laws to the same laws as the physical world and the individual. The true artist is one who sees the overall natural design with particular insight and articulates that plan through the careful choice of words in literature or the employment of visual effects, as in landscape design or painting. Wit. Wit means intellectual quickness and liveliness, inventiveness, and the capacity to see resemblance between unlike things, and thus to employ similes, metaphors, playful language, puns, in conversation, literature, art, even in garden design. As Pope says in his Essay on Criticism, true wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. When wit becomes extravagant and leads the imagination away from nature and its moderation and universality, judgment must be employed to discipline those excesses. Judgment is the exercise of those critical faculties, both moral and aesthetic, that brings man into harmony with the universal principles of the natural world and with his fellow man. Before we turn to the poem itself, let me address the verse form, where we can see how these three terms, nature, wit, and judgment, find their first and perhaps most essential embodiment. Pope employs the heroic couplet, or the pentameter couplet, a verse form that consists of 2 lines that rhyme, each line always containing 5 feet, each foot usually containing 1 unstressed and 1 stressed syllable, in that order. Like the 12-syllable Alexandrine line employed by Racine, the heroic couplet exercises considerable restraint on the form and language of the poem. Even though to us the rhymed couplet seems artificial, as critic J. Paul Hunter asserts, as the standard of both effectiveness and beauty, couplets dominated all poetry, which is to say all serious political and philosophical discourse, for more than 200 years, nearly half the recognizable English tradition. In other words, for Pope and his audience, the couplet form was the natural and inevitable form for poetry. As inheritors of a romantic sensibility, however, we still read poetry generally for its meditative or lyrical qualities, and not for its philosophical power. And so for us, the rhymed couplet is more likely to invoke a child's rhyme. We have great difficulty in seeing in the couplet the form of serious philosophical conversation. But to understand Pope's unmatched skill in employing the conversational rhythms of everyday speech in his poetry, we have to make an effort to engage with an essay on criticism on its own terms, as a serious, extended, philosophical discourse. As I said, the heroic line consists of 5 feet, each foot usually containing 1 unstressed and 1 stressed syllable. So, if we were scanning the opening couplet of the poem metrically, we would mark it thus in terms of stress. "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill." But the meter is not the same as the rhythm. The brilliance of Pope is in the way he imposes the rhythm of the speaking voice onto the meter of the poem. So when we hear those 2 lines, when we speak those 2 lines, what we hear is the stress falling in the first line on the phrase "want of skill," and in the second line on the words "writing" and "judging ill." Thus we hear the metrical beat running, as it were, underneath the rhythm of the lines. "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill." Another way of putting this is to say that the meter is nature, or natural, the heartbeat of the line, as it were, that goes on timelessly and persistently. What requires art, or wit, is the intonation of the speaking voice, the exercise of which depends upon judgment, on selecting the right words to stress in the metrical scheme of the poem. The meter doesn't tell you which words to stress. It just gives you the beat. Ta-ta, 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 ta-ta. It's judgment that provides the right choice. And so, as Pope puts it in the opening phrase of the poem, "'tis hard to say which way is the right way to speak the poem." The poem is divided into 3 parts. The first sets the context and establishes the relationship between, on the one hand, the rules of judgment, and on the other, nature and the authority of the classics. The second part details the obstacles to reaching the standards defined in the first part. And the third part argues for both a moral and aesthetic reformation, guided by general precepts, but grounded in poetic genius and the imagination. And we can see from that even though neoclassical aesthetics really privileges the idea of the universal, of the community, the insistence on poetic genius and imagination brings us to that concept of individuality that will be stressed when we get to the Romantics. In this lecture, I'm going to speak about just the first part of the poem, which is lines 1 to line 200. Pope defines and refines the key terms nature, wit, and judgment in the first part of the poem. He begins with a simple opposition and then complicates that binary. We see the development of a complex philosophical argument as each couplet prepares for the next, the sense moving beyond the meaning of individual couplets to create a pattern of meaning extending over many lines. A close analysis of the first 8 lines demonstrates Pope's skill in complicating the simple oppositions he seems to have established. "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill. But of the two, less dangerous is the offence to tire our patience than mislead our sense." Now, obviously, that is not the speed at which one reads the poem. That's the speed at which I'm reading it in order to show you how the meter and the rhythm cooperate. But the judgment is required in reading it at the conversational speed, which I will now do. And it requires, therefore, one to be very quick to grasp the meaning of the poem in order to know where the stress should fall. "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill. But of the two, less dangerous is the offence to tire our patience than mislead our sense. Some few in that, but numbers err in this. 10 censure wrong for one who writes amiss. A fool might once himself alone expose. Now one in verse makes many more in prose." A simple choice between writing and judging quickly evolves into an argument that it is more dangerous to judge amiss than write amiss, because the writer is responsible only for himself, whereas the critic is responsible for all those he leads astray. Thus, in addition to the opposition between writing and judging, we find there is also an opposition between the single poet and the mob of critics, and between the verse the poet writes and the prose, that is, the debased form of literature, that the critic writes. But Pope does not stand apart from these bad poets and worse critics, merely condemning those who write or judge amiss. In the next verse paragraph, the conversation about how to write and how to judge opens up to include the author and the reader. "'Tis with our judgments as our watches, none go just alike, yet each believes his own. In poets, as true genius is but rare, true taste as seldom is the critic's share. Both must alike from heaven derive their light, those born to judge as well as those to write. Let such teach others who themselves excel, and censure freely who have written well." So what appeared in the first verse paragraph to be one category, bad writers, bad critics, now includes the author and the audience, because all poets and critics, and that includes this author, Alexander Pope, and this particular reader, must exercise their judgment. All writers and critics, then, look to the same source for the light of judgment. They look to heaven or divine reason. Employing one of the central metaphors of the 18th century to describe natural divine order, light, Pope compares the judgment that comes from recognizing the infallible precision of God's order, nature, to the erroneous judgment of those who are guided only by their own taste. Pope defines one of the central claims of neoclassical critical theory, that the standard for what should be depicted in art and the rule by which that art should be judged can be found in the universal and the permanent, in other words, in nature. Thus, Pope turns to nature as his first and primary guide. Nature's moderation and balance should be the model for both the artist who creates and the critic who judges. First, follow nature, and your judgment frame by her just standard, which is still the same. Unerring nature, still divinely bright, one clear, unchanged, and universal light, life, force, and beauty must impart at once the source and end and test of art. Pope insists upon classical authors as the proper literary models for contemporary authors, thus distinguishing the real writers from the false popular hacks who produce novels, which by definition as new cannot be of any value. To propose the classical authors as models and to link the rules of aesthetic production to the standard of nature, Pope insists that the ancient rules are the result of the close study of nature and are themselves not made up, but discovered. Those rules of old, discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized. Nature, like liberty, is but restrained by the same laws which first herself ordained. But the laws are not to be followed blindly. Just as nature herself surprises and pleases us with some object out of the common order, so great wits sometimes may gloriously offend and rise to faults true critics dare not mend, from vulgar bounds with brave disorder part, and snatch a grace beyond the reach of art. In part 2 of the poem, Pope discusses the obstacles to proper judgment, suggesting that the most pervasive is pride, the pride in showing off one's knowledge, which corrupts right reason and obscures the truth. We note here also that Pope's essentially conservative bias is explicit when he condemns the blasphemies of a liberated press. In part 3, Pope describes the moral and aesthetic rules that produce good writing and good criticism, primarily among these being the ability to judge your own actions as well as those of the artist, and to teach with tact, something I believe that Pope himself can lay claim to in this poem. Let us now turn to another verse form in which Pope excelled and examine his mock heroic verse satire, The Rape of the Lock. The poem, published first in 1717, was occasioned by a quarrel between two prominent Roman Catholic families when Lord Petre, the baron in the poem, cut a lock from the head of Arabella Fermor, the Belinda of the poem, without her permission. John Carroll, Pope's friend and publisher and Lord Petre's cousin, asked Pope to write a poem to make a joke of the affair and bring them together through laughter. The poem is obsessively local in its details, and yet it speaks to a larger culture of pleasure that depended on the vast energy and business of the empire. The tone is that of a Horatian satire, that is, following the work of Horace, in which the follies of society are mocked in an affectionate manner. The poem's genre is mock epic, which employs the conventions of epic form and content, but substitutes the contemporary world and its follies for the heroic actions of men and gods. Pope satirizes the trivial values of his society and its failure to distinguish what matters from the petty jealousies and flirtations that occupy its time. The poem contains many of the standard elements of the epic form, for example, a dream message from the gods, the arming for battle, single combat, a journey to the underworld, and the intervention of the gods. In each case, however, Pope substitutes the events and moral values of a society that is obsessed with display, fashion, and superficiality. That same society that relies on the extensive trading which Defoe describes in the early travels of Robinson Crusoe. In other words, a society that relies on colonial expansion, enslaved labor, and mercantile trading. In Canto 1, the opening couplet, "What dire offence from amorous causes springs, what mighty contests rise from trivial things," works both to describe the nature of classical epics, the prospect of war provoked by love, and the silliness that he is about to satirize in the poem. Such doubleness of meaning, such punning of form, is carried on throughout the poem. Specifically, however, Pope is responding to Milton's epic about the fall of man from grace, Paradise Lost, published in its 12-book version in 1667, in which the dire offence is, of course, man's fall from grace as a result of Adam's love for Eve, who indeed brings mighty contests into the world through the trivial act of eating an apple. The repeated comparisons, not only to Milton's epic, but to classical epics and narratives, reminds us that one of the pleasures of the poem for the reader is the pleasure of allusion. That is, the pleasure of recognizing references to other texts with which one is familiar. Obviously, for most modern readers, that pleasure has to be supplemented with footnotes. Belinda's morning dream, which, like Eve's dream of her fall, contains warning signs, introduces us to the supernaturals who will guide the action of the poem. These light militia of the lower sky are the moral equivalents of the world they guard, light, spiteful, changeable, and inconsistent. And also, I should say, incompetent. Belinda is warned against some unknown threat, but of course, unschooled in epic revelation and omens, she has not read her Paradise Lost or Iliad, does not take the warning seriously. Only later will she recall the hints that foretold her fate. The parrot didn't speak, and Shock, the lapdog, was unkind. Belinda rises, and in a satiric version of the arming for battle undertaken by the epic hero, she prepares herself for the party she will attend later and where she will lose her prized lock of hair. All the world supplies the ornaments and trinkets for Belinda's toilette. Notice how Pope seems to make Belinda responsible for the colonial enterprise. It's only because women want to dress in such finery, it seems, that men go out and conquer new worlds and bring home the perfumes and the trinkets. We will see the same tendency to blame women for the excesses of consumer society in Swift's misogynist depictions of the ladies' dressing room, where the visible beauty supplied by paints and perfumes hides the decaying stench of a body diseased with syphilis. This is Pope's description of Belinda preparing for the party. Unnumbered treasures ope at once, and here the various offerings of the world appear. From each she, that is Belinda's maid, nicely culls with curious toil and decks the goddess with the glittering spoil. This casket India's glowing gems unlocks, and all Arabia breathes from yonder box. The tortoise here and elephant unite, transform to combs the speckled and the white. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billet doux. Now awful beauty puts on all its arms. The fair each moment rises in her charms, repairs her smiles, awakens every grace, and calls forth all the wonders of her face. Sees by degrees a purer blush arise, and keener lightnings quicken in her eyes. Notice how Pope slips in the Bible in that list of necessaries that the beauty keeps at hand. Puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, and billet doux. In Canto 2, like Cleopatra on the Nile, Belinda journeys on the Thames to the Hampton Court Palace, ravishing all alike with her beauty, a beauty ironically set off by the diamond cross she wears around her neck. But it is her hair, and the sexual implications in this poem about the rape of a lock are rife. It is her curls that are the cause of man's destruction, and particularly ensnare the Baron, who has built an altar to love, to implore help. For this, ere Phoebus rose, he had implored propitious heaven, and every power adored, but chiefly love. To love an altar built of 12 vast French romances neatly gilt. There lay 3 garters, half a pair of gloves, and all the trophies of his former loves. With tender billet doux he lights the pyre, and breathes 3 amorous sighs to raise the fire. Ariel, Belinda's chief protector, summons the fairy guardians and assigns them their duties. To guard against the disaster warned of in Belinda's dream, whether it be the loss of virginity or the loss of a necklace, the staining of her honor or the staining of a dress. Thus, Pope mocks both the seriousness with which these socialites take themselves, that they should need guardians as heroes do, and the lack of seriousness that they show in matters of morality. It is not only the partygoers, the society of Belinda and the Baron, who are without moral sensitivity. While they talk, take tea and flirt, judges outside are condemning men to death. Such is the context of this heroic contest. After a game of cards, staged as a mock heroic battle, and the taking of coffee, a luxury that depends upon the labour of slaves, the Baron takes up his scissors and cuts off the coveted lock. The pier now spreads the glittering forefex wide to enclose the lock, now joins it to divide. Even then, before the fatal engine closed, a wretched sylph too fondly interposed. Fate urged the shears and cut the sylph in twain, but airy substance soon unites again. The death and resurrection of the sylph recalls the account of angelic sex in Paradise Lost, when Raphael describes to Adam how the angels merge into one. The explicit sexual language also reminds the reader of those epic stories that begin in the rape or abduction of a woman. The triviality of this episode is emphasized by Belinda's exaggerated response. Screams of horror rend the sky. The exaggeration of is then undermined by the comparison of such cries to those that follow from the death of husbands or lapdogs. Pope condemns the confusion of small matters with great, and the subsequent confusion of moral responses that results from this failure to distinguish important events from minor personal problems. Moreover, in the death and resurrection of the sylph, we are reminded that in real battle, those who are severed do not recover so easily. Belinda demands that her knight, Sir Plume, challenge the Baron and retrieve the precious hares. Sir Plume of amber snuff-box, justly vain, and the nice conduct of a clouded cane, with earnest eyes and round unthinking face, he first the snuff-box opened, then the case, and thus broke out, "My lord, why what the devil's sound, damn the lock, for gad you must be civil, plague on it, 'tis past jest, nay prithee, pox, give her the hair." He spoke and rapped his box. Sir Plume is naturally unsuccessful, and Belinda takes up arms. In the confusion, the lock is lost, but the poet consoles Belinda with the thought that it has been transformed into a constellation, a kind of permanence that her beauty can never hope to obtain. In this final reminder of the insignificance of the argument over the lock, the poet also reminds Belinda and all who would behave as she has done that even those who can murder with their eyes must themselves die at last. What good then will be all the tresses that fair head can boast? And indeed, Lord Petre, the Baron, was dead of smallpox by the time Pope published this version of the poem. Pope's delicate reminder of the dark side of life is in accord with his general optimism about the possibility for rational and civilized behaviour. Like Voltaire, Pope finds some hope in the ability of his readers to laugh at themselves. If they can laugh, perhaps they can find a way to restore the harmony they have disrupted and reflect upon the triviality of their lives.